So I'm back for part 2 of classical Christian education. And if you remember, last time was probably about 6 weeks ago, early September. We did part 1. What we thought was just going to be a one-shot deal with classical Christian education ended up being turning into 2 parts. And now I have to say it's going to be 3 parts. So the third part's probably going to be in January. And that part is going to focus really on the Christian aspect of this. The first part, just really quick review, back in September we talked about what classical education is. And you can read it's been up there for a while, you probably have read it, but just the overall summary of it and what it instills in the students in terms of love of beauty and virtue and many other characteristics. And you had a handout on that. There is a handout for today. If you don't have it, it is up there in the back. So maybe somebody can run. Kevin's going to come around and hand that out too. So today we're going to talk about how it works, what it entails. So really going to talk about the nuts and bolts of classical Christian education. I tell you, our kids have been involved in it from day one. Now our oldest is in 9th grade. We've been in classical conversations, and I know several of you all have kids or have had family members in that. And I've always just trusted that it's the right thing. And my wife is kind of, I just trust her when it came to that. And I've always heard good things about classical Christian education and all that stuff. But in my deep dive the last year or last 6 months, is really starting with this book and the class I did last spring on just education and what's gone wrong and the answer. I am a true believer. I don't think there's another way. Anyways, so like I said, today we're just going to talk about how it works, what it entails, and the first and foremost thing about it is God is everywhere. If you know the Shorter Catechism, question number 10, where is God? God is everywhere. And that permeates classical Christian education. I'm going to call it CCE for short. And I just want to talk about how that is true and how also history permeates every single subject matter throughout CCE. So God is everywhere, history is everywhere. I'm going to read a lot of things out of Doug Wilson, Dorothy Sayers, Pete Hegseth. These guys can really summarize these things much better than I can, so I think there's just some really good quotes here. A German exchange student once visited classical Christian school for 6 months. When asked of his experience, he commented, "It was good, but everything was about religion. I know this is a Christian school, but why was God in every subject also?" He experienced classical Christian education as it forms paideia. The truth is everything. Is everything, underlying how you think about everything. It influences everything. The deepest purpose of classical Christian education is to cultivate Christian wisdom and virtue in students. And then as far as history goes, as you walk into a CCE school, you will see history everywhere, on the walls, in the entryways, in the hallways, in the books, in the costumes at the school events. Ancient Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Byzantine, early Anglo-Saxon, medieval, French, German, Asian, and it goes on, right down to American history. And always alongside is biblical and church history. Classical Christian schools orient their years, months, and coursework around a historical context. So that is the overall picture of it as they do the deep dive into the subject matter and how they teach the subject matter. God is everywhere. History is everywhere. So Christopher Perrin from Classical Academic Press puts it this way: classical Christian education, when it comes to the subject matter, integrating the subjects, as I've talked about before, progressive education, whether it's Christian or public, and most Christian education out there is progressive education. They put subject matter into silos. They separate them completely. They form walls around them. So he says classical Christian education is more like a web than a chest of drawers. And I thought that was a really good comparison. Progressive education is you open this drawer, you get math. You open this drawer, you get English. You open this drawer, you get social studies or whatever, science, whatever. Whereas classical Christian education, it's a web. It all integrates. It all overlaps. There are no subjects that are unrelated to others. The boundaries between subjects are light and fluid and emphasize the interrelationship of all knowledge. So Pete Hegseth says, the fathers of modern American social sciences hijacked education and redefined nearly every area of study, shattering education into dozens of specialties. Course names like social studies, sociology, anthropology, psychology. We can go on. It's a huge list here. These reduce knowledge to information learned for a test, compartmentalized, and easily forgotten. The narrow silos of knowledge are not interrelated, so they offer little wisdom. An integrated world makes no more sense to an atheist than a pile of random rocks at the bottom of a hillside. Things just happen to be the way they are. There is no deeper or higher meaning to be discovered in anything. Any attempt to integrate, say, psychology with political science in order to trace common examples of God's hand across the disciplines is pointless if there is no master architect. For example, our founding fathers integrated politics and theology when they realized that sinful nature leads to tyranny wherever power is concentrated. Sinful nature, a Christian idea or a Christian reality, and tyranny, wherever power is concentrated, a political reality. We can just look at history for that, and we can look at our own situation in this country for that. As a result, we got divided powers in government, a republic, not a democracy, and a Bill of Rights. Social sciences do not integrate, so they give democracy an open, unlimited pass. This leads to the pure foolishness of mob rule, something our classically educated founders understood and warned against. In secondary classrooms at CCE schools, teachers are widely read in the classics and great ideas, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the economics of Adam Smith, Marx, and Keynes relate to the politics of Jefferson, Lenin, and Roosevelt. And these ideas descend from the ideas of Hesiod, Xenophon, I don't know if I'm pronouncing all that right, and Aristotle, among others. Of course, biblical passages shed light of the truth in the economic discussions. The conversation in the classroom is all about, of all these people and ideas and scripture at once without false partitions. It's not about information, which we see in progressive education. The real objective is to train the minds to think through the ideas carefully. Francis Schaeffer wrote, "Today we have a weakness in our education process in failing to understand the natural associations between the disciplines. We tend to study all our disciplines in unrelated parallel lines. This tends to be true in both Christian and secular education." This is in the 1970s, I believe, Schaeffer was active writing. Is that correct? This is one of the reasons why evangelical Christians have been taken by surprise at the tremendous shift that has come in our generation. Boy, was that prophetic. So, and then Dorothy Sayers has something to say about, she has a lot to say, but she, if you haven't read her book or her essay on the lost tools of learning, you should definitely read that. It's one of the sources. But she says, although we often succeed in teaching our pupils subjects, we fail lamentably on the whole in teaching them how to think. They learn everything except the art of learning. And that goes into the integrated subjects matter. Also, you have on the Classical Christian website, this is the Association of Classical Christian Schools. where we have, where did I say? I don't know if I pulled this up. Integrated subjects. Well, I thought I did. There we go. So to integrate subjects means to remove barriers between areas of study and to make connections among subjects because all truth ultimately belongs to God. We go on and talks about how they integrate the subjects. And then I just want to read this passage here at the bottom where it says, all truth is God's truth. The most important reason we integrate subjects is because every subject should be oriented towards God. Every subject can be learned with a Christian worldview, giving students the mental habit of seeing Christ everywhere in everything. God reigns in history, his consistency is shown in math, his powerful creativity in science, and human nature is explored in literature. And it goes on to talk about the old books, the classic books, and the great ideas. So this is, why CCE integrates the subjects, and why progressive education has separated them, because its ultimate goal is to remove God. If you don't believe that, then read this book. So the Socratic approach, this goes back to Socrates' time, where you would have discussion, you have debate, you'd have people sitting around a table, you'd have a leader, they shoot out a question, should something happen, should this be this way or that way, and the people come to the table having studied that, whatever subject matter it is, and they discuss it, and they debate it. A real debate, not the debates that you see on TV for presidents. So they actually go back and forth and talk about subjects for a while. And if you could go back to, the Lincoln-Douglas debates where they would spend 3 hours on one subject or something, wouldn't that be awesome to see something like that with our presidential candidates? So that's the Socratic approach. And the website here talks about that real briefly, the Socratic discussion. In the Socratic method, also known by the Greek word elenchus, students discuss a question under the guidance of a teacher in order to come to a factual and faithful conclusion. Students must argue their points well, think through the logical implication of every proposition, and precisely understand each word's definition. It teaches students to critique others' arguments respectfully and gracefully accept the critique of others. So that is part of the later part of the trivium, which is mainly the high school years. And we'll talk about the trivium here in a second. So fewer textbooks and more great books. What does that mean? So today what we have in schools are textbooks, just dominated by textbooks. They're secondary sources. What secondary sources do is they extract what they think is important and leave out what they think is not important. What can happen when that happens? It can get skewed. It can be bent to a certain viewpoint. It can be bent to a certain agenda. And we have that rampant in our textbooks today in education. So what CCE does is it goes back to the original sources. So it throws out most of the textbooks, and we go back to the great books, the great ideas. So what the website here has about the great books. Great books and art have stood the test of time and over time communicate truth, goodness, and beauty in a substantial way. Most include ideas that have influenced and shaped history and the development of Western civilization, and have added meaningfully to the great conversation. In this way, they are important pieces of cultural heritage. C.S. Lewis has some good input on this. It is a good rule after reading a new book never to allow yourself another new one until you have read an old one in between. C.S. Lewis made one of the strongest arguments for reading old words. They allow us to step out of the assumptions of our time and place and to live and experience another. We don't do this because the people back then had no problems, but rather because they had different problems than we do, or confronted them in different ways. When we step out of our usual ways of thinking, we see the world through different lenses. And when we have seen with different lenses, we are better equipped to see problems in our own time, to understand the past, and to learn from our predecessors. And then this quote from C.S. Lewis also, every age has its own outlook. It is specifically good at seeing certain truths and especially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. And then going back to the great books also install virtue, which is something textbooks cannot do. Textbooks throw out a lot of facts and some facts and throw out some other facts in a bad way. But the great books, let's see here, and the original sources. There are other reasons to focus on original sources. The Latin term ad fontes, which means to the source of the spring, is used to describe the virtue of reading the original source or a close translation, rather than depending on a textbook. Today, scholarship has all but quit trying to be objective. Textbooks have descended into more progressive propaganda. Great books have another function. They cultivate virtue. You cannot teach virtue simply by telling students this is good or this is evil. Of course, that is part of it, but CCE schools do not strive to train students to know good from evil, but rather they seek to develop a love of the good and a hatred of evil in students. John Milton said education should seek to repair the wounds of our first parents. In other words, knowing what is good is insufficient. To repair the damage, we need to create an affection for goodness. So what is a great book? It is a book that has stood the test of time, usually by contributing to an original idea to the conversation about truth, goodness, and beauty that descends from at least 3 millennia of the Western Christian tradition. And this is something that we see has been completely thrown out of public education. So, more storybooks, less facts books. My oldest he's got 1 foot in 8th grade, 1 foot in 9th grade, homeschool. But he loves facts. To get him to read an adventure story is like, pulling the sock out of my dog's jaws, He loves facts. He'd much rather sit down and read the manual for the washing machine than an adventure boy book. I kid you not. That's the way he is. Statistics, everything. And that's great, but we need to cultivate an imagination in our children. No matter how they're wired, they need to have an imagination. And storybooks do that. We have an education system now where it's just throwing facts, statistics, at preparing them for the test. And then as soon as they're done or they're graduated, all that information goes out and they forget it. And they have no sense of virtue, beauty, a love of beauty, a love for goodness, and they have no imagination. So that's why more storybooks, less statistical books that we see today. So now we get into the heart of CCE, the trivium and the quadrivium. And the trivium this is pretty much where education in this country still, or throughout the world, is actually in Western countries, is actually still modeled after this. So the trivium is in 3 sections. It's grammar stage, which is your elementary years, basically. You have the logic stage, which is your middle school years. And then you have the rhetoric stage, which is your high school years, basically. And that's how our education system was originally set up, and it still is in terms of those categories. So the trivium I'll just read what Sayers talks about here. When visiting the youngest CCE classrooms, you will notice few differences between students there and at other schools, but the older they get, the more exceptionally mature they seem, especially compared to their progressive school peers. In classical schools, the trivium, which is grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the first three of the 7 liberal arts, changes with the child. And it does so, as it does so, it changes the child. It makes them active learners, thinkers, and articulate leaders. Think of the trivium as a skeletal frame of all learning, the bones of the arms, spine, and legs, to which all other human studies attach. Dorothy Sayers brought the 7 liberal arts into focus with her essay. She prescribes a return to the trivium, which trains students in reasoning and persuasion, and the quadrivium, discussed shortly, which trains students in a philosophical form of science. Is what she called the Pol Pot stage. Oh, not Pol Pot. Go shoot him in the head. No, Pol Parrot stage. Sorry. Our kids in public education would have no idea what I just referenced to. Yeah, I can't say Freudian slip there. Pol Parrot stage. So at the young years, elementary years, the kids, they want to just copy, right? They memorize so easily. We all know how hard memorization is when we get up into our adult years. I'm not proud of this fact, but I look back at what I memorized when I was a child, and they're all just a bunch of Van Halen and Journey tunes. I could, 40 years ago, I could memorize, I could recite an entire song. I wish those were Bible verses, looking back on it. And now I try to memorize Bible verses, and that's hard. And then if I stop, I memorize them after 2 weeks or something, and then a month later I can't remember them. So those years are important for really building up the information in our children, because they just soak it in like a sponge, and they retain it. So they are learning the language, they are learning the structure of everything, the grammar of everything at this age. They're just learning it through songs, through poetry and whatnot. So the grammar phase, students in K through 6, while the grammar phase described by Sayers ends at about 6th grade, grammar continues to be emphasized through the study of classical languages in secondary school. Students in middle school advance to their, in classical school, I'm getting off here. Classical school, students memorize great poetry, hymns, songs, the Bible, and other literary pieces to impress a stamp of beauty, timelessness, and culture on their souls. So they're learning, like I said, the grammar of everything. So every single subject, when we talk about grammar, we're talking about the details, the facts of everything. So I have all this listed here. I don't need to go through it all, but history, you have all those things in terms of history, geography, science, math, Latin, your native language, English in our case, and then theology is part of that too. So by the time they're in 6th grade, the things that our kids can recite after 5 years, 6 years of learning this stuff through poetry, through songs and whatnot, I'm floored. Most of it I don't know, and I'm being honest. It's crazy what they know. They don't understand most of it, but they have it here. And then in the later years, that's when they begin to understand it and discuss it and whatnot. So that takes us to the logic years, which are the middle school years, basically. And that's where the students begin to understand and take apart everything they've memorized. You're teaching reasoning, and and they begin to understand how to discuss the information that they've learned in those elementary years. Dorothy Sayers made the point that adolescents love to argue. Okay, so in these middle school years, we have kids that develop a great sense of arguing. We know this. Most of us have had those kids at those stages. We have one smack dab in the middle of it right now, and he tries to find every possible way to get you in a gotcha moment, you know? And it's just their nature at that stage. And Sayers talks about how we need to cultivate this, okay? She calls it a nuisance value. So it's a nuisance, but it's a value that should be treasured. So we should encourage disagreement with these kids, but in a respectful and a well-reasoned way. We should encourage it. Okay, Dorothy Sayers made the point that adolescents love to argue, so we should teach them how to argue well. CCE calls this the logic or sometimes the dialectic stage. Students practice logical exercises through events like public discourse and debate. For classical schools, logic is not just a course, it is infused in all the courses that are taught in the middle school years, and logic is expected to be mastered in grades 10 and up. With advanced reading skills that students gain from the earlier grades in the classical school, the elementary years, these students can comprehend the complex ideas present in ancient literature. They can read philosophers and playwrights like Socrates, Aristotle, and understand their reasoning. Hegseth says, skeptical, most people are, but when they see what the average kid can do when they get an extraordinary education like this, they become believers. When the students are stretched, they grow. And then, in the process of doing all this, and this goes back to the grammar stage, the students are actually enjoying what they're doing. They actually look forward to their homework, or they look forward to going to class because they can partake in these discussions and they can feed their desire to, catch somebody in a debate or whatever. So they actually really do enjoy what they're doing, unlike most education kids just can't stand it. They just it's so dry. Sayers also goes on, well, this is Douglas Wilson, and then also he quotes Sayers. This argumentative tendency is in full bloom around 6th and 7th grade. As children mature, they tend to use the information learned in the course of their studies in disputation. They love to try to catch their parents, the teachers, and the schoolmates in any kind of error. Instead of suppressing this tendency, teachers should use it. And Sayers says, it will doubtless be objected that to encourage young persons at the pert age, that's this middle school year, to browbeat, correct, and argue with their elders will render them perfectly intolerable. My answer is that children of that age are intolerable anyhow, and that their natural argumentativeness may just as well be canalized to good purpose as allowed to run away into the sands. Wilson goes on, this does not mean that educators give in to this kind of argumentativeness. Instead, the teacher molds it and shapes it. So this is the PERT years, the middle school years, the logic years, where they are just trained the formal and informally, the skills of logic, the skills of reasoning, the skills of debate, et cetera, et cetera. Then we have the rhetoric years. How are we doing on time here? We have the rhetoric years, which are the high school years. And this is where they are engaging in the Socratic approach. And where they're sitting around the tables and they're doing discourse through debates, they're doing essays, they're doing speech, and they're building the foundation upon the foundation that they've established in the grammar years and the middle school years there, the logic years. They are developing a sense of creativity in these years. They're learning how to express themselves in their language. So these years are really important in terms of just forming the students' ability to just grow in their own personal ways through these settings of debate and discourse. They also are developing a sense of what subjects they have a true interest in, that they're maybe eventually going into professionally. So we try to cultivate that. At the same time, we're not siloing them off like they do in public education. So at the same time, they're still learning all the other subjects, still reading the great books and whatnot. And so in a Socratic debate, the teacher, well, if you wander into the school of rhetoric, things may seem even more alien. First, you'll notice students are engaged in discourse, discussion, debate, a significant portion of the day. This typically takes place around a Socratic table. The teacher asks a question, something big, ethical question like, should Charles Colson have taken the fall for Nixon? The question is then an example. The question in this example may follow a reading from Jefferson, or these guys, these Greek guys that I can't pronounce, so I'm not going to pronounce them. Students then engage the question with each other around a table. The students agree, disagree, support their arguments, asking more penetrating questions. The teacher leads this, and if it gets off course, the teacher will bring them back in a little bit. The teacher engages with corrective questioning to ensure that the answer is consistent with biblical wisdom. This process exercises students' power of reason and develops an order to their loves, which forms virtue. Rather than being told what right and wrong are, they become to understand and reach right conclusions in countless real-world situations. So, at the end of the rhetoric stage, once they're graduating from high school, basically, they are required to do a thesis. You don't usually see that until like master's degree, or maybe bachelor's degree if you're in like an honors program or something. But a thesis, and then you have to defend the thesis in front of a faculty panel. So they've been really put through the ringer. After that is the quadrivium, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that, but the quadrivium seeks to encounter God's wisdom by looking at nature, thereby drawing closer to wisdom himself. The four arts of the quadrivium are arithmetic, the study of numbers, geometry, music, and astronomy. Note that all of these four use mathematics and physics to understand the nature of things, which the Greeks believed were basic reflections of the transcendent logos, or language of God. So, briefly, we're going to talk about the dead languages, and mainly Latin. We see Latin mostly in CCE. Sometimes you see Greek, but mostly Latin. And Latin really provides a foundation for language, whether it's English, French, German, Italian, Spanish. I mean, it really is amazing what Latin, the roots of our languages are from Latin. And I just want to read a couple things that's going to kind of summarize what you see here on the page. And they tend to appreciate literature, the understanding of culture, their own culture, the ancient cultures. So the study of Latin provides a great foundation from which to study other modern languages. The help it would be in the study of languages that are direct descendants of Latin is obvious. The student would have a head start on French, Spanish, Italian, and others. The students could have a good understanding of around 80% of the vocabulary of these languages. In addition, he or she would have a solid grasp of how an inflected language works, which would be a considerable help with Russian or even or German. So, and then Sayers talks about this also. I will say at once, quite firmly, that the best grounding for education is the Latin grammar. I say this not because Latin is traditional and medieval, but simply because even a rudimentary knowledge of Latin cuts down the labor and pains of learning almost any other subject by at least 50%. It is the key to the vocabulary and structure of all the Romance languages and to the structure of the Teutonic languages, as well as to the technical vocabulary of all the sciences and to the literature of the entire Mediterranean civilization, together with all its historical documents. Finally, I just want to kind of read some examples of what Latin, what a Latin-based education does. So this is at Logos School, which is the CCE school out in Moscow, Idaho. They give English vocabulary tests to some of the Latin students. The test involves English words with which the students would be generally unfamiliar. Some of the unfamiliar words had roots in the Latin. The sixth graders who took the test correctly identified 81% of the words with a Latin origin, while they identified only 33% of those words not of Latin origin. Third graders taking the test did equally well. They correctly identified 85% of the words derived from Latin and only 33% of the other words. In short, the students were able to understand English words based on their study of Latin, and this without a formal instruction on how to make the translation. Similarly, the elementary school journal reported that in Philadelphia, this is in the 1970s, fourth through sixth graders received 15 to 20 minutes of daily Latin instruction. The vocabulary subtest of the Iowa test was used to compare scores of pupils who had studied Latin with scores of pupils who had not. And what was the result? The performance of Latin pupils was 1 full year higher than the performance of those who had not studied Latin. There's a couple others, I know we're pressed on time, but this is the director of Association of American Medical Colleges back in the mid 20th century. In my opinion, Latin and the Greek are the most valuable subjects in the college curriculum. This association is opposed to too much science, and it definitely favors and recommends a cultural education with the classics as a basis. Personally, I would unhesitatingly accept as a medical student one who is long on the classics, especially Greek, and short on science. Physicians should be educated, not trained. It has been 50 years since this was said, but the principle to which he appeals holds true. And then this is a chemist says, I question him as to the relative capacities of students coming to his classes from the classical gymnasium and the real Schulen, respectively. I presumed that his best chemical students came to him from the real Schulen. These are German words. How the Germans are set up with their education. Not at all, he replied. All my best students come from the gymnasium. The students from the real Schulen do best at first, but after 3 months' work here, they are, as a rule, left behind by those coming from the gymnasium. And the gymnasium is where they teach Latin. How do you account for that, I asked. I understand that students at the real Schulen are especially instructed in chemistry. And he says, yes, but the students from the gymnasium have the best trained minds. Give me a student who has been taught his Latin grammar, and I will answer for his chemistry. And then finally, consider the following experiment. Take an average graduate of a modern American high school and take a student of the same age who came out of one of these 17th century schools. Enroll them both at Behemoth U, this is Wilson talking, in one of our remaining rigorous disciplines, say chemistry. Who would do better? It would be a contest between a trained mind encountering unfamiliar material and an untrained mind encountering familiar material. The answer should be obvious. So the statistics behind Latin as a base in learning are just immense. I mean, you'd have to put your head in the sand to just say there's no relation. So that brings us to the end here. We have lots of resources there again that you can look up. This is how classical Christian education is built and how the framework of it. Like I said, next time we'll talk about the Christian aspect of this and how important that is. It's not just a classical education as the Greeks did, but it's the Christian part of it that's infused by the Western culture.